Historians, along with pretty much every teenager that's ever lived, has loved their share of memes. One of the most popular memes is the idea that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. The United States, the Soviet Union, to some extent the Greek Empire of Alexandria. The list goes on and on. Today, my argument is going to be that Afghanistan is not the graveyard of empires, rather, it's going to be the two countries we talk about today, Vietnam and Korea. First, we're going to start with Korea. Now, Korea isn't going to be as much of a graveyard of empires as Vietnam will be, and it's not going to kill off any empires quite yet. But it's going to happen. Looking at you, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Now, if Egypt is the gift of the Nile, Korea is the creation of a very rough neighborhood, specifically having to the north and east, um, basically the colossus of East Asia, China. The great balancing act of Korean history is going to be how can we incorporate Chinese culture, Chinese traditions, Chinese technology, and yet still be Korean at the same time? Sometimes that question is a false dichotomy. As you might expect, because of the fact that the North has a border with China throughout most of its history, the fact is that many of the early settlers to Korea were in fact Han Chinese. Korea more or less forms into a state in the 2nd century BCE, and it's called Joseon. But eventually, Joseon gets replaced by the Three Kingdoms period that really begins in roughly the 600s. So what happens is you have a northern kingdom that's fairly militaristic, called Koguro or Goguryeo, depending upon the source that you read. My pronunciation is going to be extremely terrible, by the way. Then you have really two other kingdoms, Silla and Paikcha. Now, of all the kingdoms, like Silla is maybe the most pathetic looking all in all, but it's actually this one that ends up sort of ahead of the game. The reason it is able to basically conquer most of the Korean peninsula is that essentially Silla sort of kowtows to the Tang Dynasty, and as a consequence, the Silla are basically allies, and the Silla Dynasty gradually conquers most of the Korean peninsula. Now, because of this military support, the Silla Dynasty owes the Tang a favor. And by the way, history kind of demonstrates that whenever you owe a global or at least local superpower a favor, that's sort of a dangerous situation to be in. So, because of the fact that the Tang had basically sent in its forces to help the Silla conquer most of Korea, the Tang forces don't really go anywhere after the conquest. And so then the question has to be asked, is Korea under the control of the Koreans, or is it actually under the control of the Tang Dynasty? Eventually, there is a compromise that's reached where the Tang essentially evacuate their forces, but in return, the Silla dynasty has to acknowledge the Tang emperors as being their overlords, essentially. On the one hand, this means that the new kingdom of Koryo or Goryeo, basically, again, it's just a pronunciation difference, but the new state is a tribute state of the Tang. But in reality, if you remember how tribute states really work, as long as you acknowledge the overlordship of China, more or less the Chinese would allow you to sort of run your society as you saw fit. So in practice, Korean rulers during this time period have a lot of independence and autonomy. Note that that will not always be the case. My God, have I found a superior hat to this? Just like the case of Japan with the Taika reforms, you see the gradual sinification of Korean society and the Korean government. What's interesting about the Korean sinification is that they accept Confucianism, but they don't accept the idea of merit that goes with it. There are no real examination systems like you see in the case of China. What actually happens is that Instead of this division between the aristocracy and the bureaucracy that you see in China, you see the aristocracy and the bureaucracy actually merge together Voltron style, which is kind of interesting. Also, the aristocracy sort of prevents the total adoption of Confucianism because Confucianism is all about scholarship. And you get the impression that many of these aristocrats are sort of looking at Confucianism and they're sort of like, we don't write poetry here. Around 400 CE, Chinese style writing appears on the Korean Peninsula. And also, during this time period, you see the emergence of Buddhism. Now, Buddhism is officially adopted and favored over Confucianism, at least at this point. What eventually is going to happen, spoiler, is Korea will sort of present itself as the true preserver of Confucian influence, but we're not quite there yet. But for now, Buddhism is the favored child, and the Korean imperial family essentially takes Buddhism and goes all Empress Wu on it and starts to build these royal monasteries and that kind of thing. You also see the emergence of Chinese architecture and city planning, just like pretty much everybody else in East Asia with a pulse. You had Koreans essentially go and tour the Chinese capital city of Chang'an, thought it was like the best thing ever, and they actually wanted to model their capital of Kumsan off of Chang'an. You don't see any distinctive merchant class form, and at the very least, you don't see the Confucian-based discrimination of merchants. It should be noted that Korea doesn't think of itself as the Middle Kingdom in quite the same way that China does, and because of its relationship with China, it has access to the Silk Road. So important products that Korea produces. They create these pale green bowls called, I think, Celadon. So it's called Celadon ceramics, gilt bronze, gold, and jade work. In order to talk about the past, let's talk about the future. In 1979, the largest army in East Asia, and debatably the largest army on the planet at the time, the People's Liberation Army of China, invades Vietnam. So, on the one hand, you have a near global superpower with, again, the largest army in at least the region, versus a country with a population that is minuscule compared to China and that has endured up to this point nearly 4 to 5 decades of literal constant warfare. Who wins? Well, of course, Vietnam does, because of course it does. And if you're a student of Vietnamese history, this makes perfect sense, because the Mongols tried to invade, and they got war elephanted. The Japanese invade during World War II, and they sort of have a stressful time of it. Then the French come back and try to reclaim Vietnam as part of their empire. They lose pretty hard. Then the United States, well, it also has kind of a complicated history with Vietnam that does not end well. And then, shortly after the Vietnam War, China decides to get in on the action and invade, and they get their butts handed to them. By the way, you can argue that that had a pretty long-term effect on the People's Liberation Army because since that time period, it has not fought a major war. So if Korea sort of accommodates Chinese influence by going with the flow, Vietnam adopts the strategy of fight pretty much constantly.
Pinky. Hi, this is Pinky.
Start again. Hold on.
Go.
This is Pinky.
This is Vietnam.
Cat, domestic short hair. He's available for adoption. He's pet of the week, Placer County Animal Shelter. He's a very loving cat.
Hang on, please. Oh, here. Pinky.
Pinky.
Pinky. Whoa. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Well, we got a wildcat on our hands. Pinky, settle down, bud. Careful, Cole. Well, I get a catch Cole. Somebody get a catch Cole. Just sit over.
No.
Just catch Cole.
Get top all together.
Yeah, because I'm not going to grab him.
Oh. Dude. Watch it start up in there. Just disconnect it from the deck.
So yeah, that's pretty much the history of Vietnam in a nutshell. Vietnam had and still has an awkward relationship with its northern neighbor, China, even though a lot of Vietnamese culture is partially based in Chinese culture. Just to give you sort of a modern example of how unstable that relationship is, Vietnam, as many of you know, is a communist country. China, as many of you know, is a communist country. So, who is Vietnam's ally? Well, of course, the United States, because it would rather ally with a capitalist free market democracy that's far, far away, that it recently had a multi-decades long war with, than a communist superpower to the north. Because, of course. The Chinese have historically referred to the Viets as southern barbarians, and parts of Vietnam was occupied during the time period of Han China. The idea is that the marshy terrain was obviously good for growing things like rice, that is where the almighty Champa rice comes from. And so the idea is that Vietnam would sort of become a breadbasket of the Chinese state. Obviously, things kind of go pear-shaped when the Han Empire collapses. The Tang armies invade. The Vietnamese actively resist them. Vietnam is made a tribute state, but there are on-again, off-again rebellions. Most Chinese sinification is forced upon Vietnam as opposed to Korea, where you see some voluntary adoptions. So Confucianism does arrive in Vietnam, though it's interesting that you don't really see the same type of scholar bureaucracy that you do in China. And most of the scholars, the bureaucrats, are dispersed into like the towns and villages as opposed to being concentrated in like the national capital. In the case of Vietnam, and in a foreshadowing of what's to come, you don't just see a resistance from political elites in Vietnam, you see it from all strata of society, including peasants and women. And of course, the fact that Vietnam is distant from China, it's sort of away from most Chinese infrastructure, and it's hard to kind of get there. And even once you get there, the terrain is mostly filled with jungle, marshes, and it's not exactly hospitable to armies. Vietnam is very interesting because it sort of stands at the crossroads between India and Chinese cultural influences. So, on the one hand, you have a Vietnamese language that's not really related to Chinese whatsoever, but the written language of Vietnam most definitely is. The Chinese language has basically been used in Vietnam, at least in its written form, for over 1,000 years. Even in those areas where there are a lot of overlaps between Chinese and Vietnamese culture, you see some profound differences. So the Vietnamese are passionately Buddhist. We talked about the fact that during the Tang Dynasty, you had Empress Wu, who was just a formal patron of Buddhism, and Buddhism was incredibly popular during the Tang Dynasty. Well, Vietnamese Buddhism is Theravada Buddhism, which is more sort of, it comes more from India, whereas Chinese Buddhism is Mahayana Buddhism, which is very, very different. So we've already talked about the fact that Confucianism, even in Vietnam, looks different. So Confucianism in China tends to involve the centrality and the supremacy of the state, whereas in Vietnam, it tends to favor local autonomy, and you have local scholar bureaucrats, live in autonomous villages as opposed to, living in mostly in the national capital. Also, China emphasizes patriarchy and minimizes female roles, whereas Vietnam is, I'm not going to say that it's perfectly egalitarian, but it allows women to have greater freedom. One example you can see of this is that in Confucian China, women were mandated to wear long black pants, whereas in Vietnam, women were allowed to wear skirts. But maybe the most dramatic difference between China and Vietnam is going to be in the future. As many of you know, China is on a collision course with the largest empire in human history, the Mongol Empire. Vietnam is on a collision course as well. But the story of Vietnam turns out much differently than that of China. Till next time.